November 3, 1895. Cold Creek, Oregon. 4:47 a.m. Deputy Marshal Theodore Vasquez could not have known, as his boot broke through the rotted planking of the Morrow sisters' kitchen floor, that he was standing directly above 23 corpses. Behind him, the Pacific roared against basalt cliffs that rose 200 feet from black water. Ahead, through morning fog so thick it turned the world to wet wool, lay the boarding-house that had fed on men for 3 years. Between the two, 33 families would never receive answers. Cold Creek was not a town. It was a mistake of geography, a fishing outpost clinging to Oregon's most hostile coastline like a barnacle to ship hull. 18 miles north of the nearest settlement, accessible only by a trail that winter storms rendered impassable for months, it existed in a pocket of time where 1895 felt more like 1795. No telegraph. No railroad. No law except what men made themselves. The Morrow boarding house commanded the only flat ground in Cold Creek, a shelf of rock 50 feet above the creek mouth where salt water met fresh in violent confusion. Behind it, coastal mountains rose in walls of Douglas fir and Sitka spruce so dense that noon felt like dusk. Before it, the Pacific extended to a horizon that seemed to curve away from humanity itself. Sisters Abigail and Constance Morrow had come to Cold Creek in 1892, after their father, Captain Ezekiel Morrow, drowned off Cape Disappointment with 12 crew. They were women of severe beauty. Abigail, 42, stood nearly 6 feet tall with hands large as a longshoreman's. Constance, 38, was smaller but possessed eyes of such pale blue they appeared colorless in certain light. Both wore black without cessation, citing permanent mourning. The boarding-house they opened filled a desperate need. Cold Creek sat at the mouth of a salmon run so rich that fishermen traveled from San Francisco, Seattle, even Boston for autumn season. But the nearest hotel was 18 miles of hell trail away. The Morrows offered clean beds, hot meals, and prices that seemed almost charitable, $2 weekly, meals included. Fair Christian women, the first guest called them. Thomas Brennan, fisherman from Massachusetts, wrote his wife in September 1892, "The Morrow ladies keep a tight ship, quote scripture at breakfast, and their chowder could convert a heathen. The Lord surely guides their hands." Brennan's body was identified 3 years later by the wedding ring still on his finger, recovered from 15 feet of seawater beneath the boarding-house kitchen. The first disappearance that anyone questioned occurred in October 1892. Samuel Hartwick, salmon fisherman from Portland, had sent regular letters to his pregnant wife, Mary. The letters stopped October 18th. Mary received no notice of death, no recovered body, no property returned. When she wrote to Cold Creek's general store, the only address she had, the storekeeper, Jacob Finch, replied, "Morrow ladies say he headed south. Left owing rent. That's all anyone knows." But Samuel Hartwick had not headed south. He had descended. The Morrow sisters purchased their first chains in November 1892 from a blacksmith in Astoria, 120 feet of anchor chain at $4.50 per length. For a boarding-house miles from harbor, it was an unusual expense. When the blacksmith asked their purpose, Abigail had smiled. "Storm anchors for the house, sir. These cliffs take terrible wind. The Lord provides, but we must secure his provisions." The blacksmith thought nothing of it. Coastal people bought strange things. Between 1892 and 1895, the Morrow sisters made 17 documented trips to Astoria, Newport, and Tillamook. They purchased chains, padlocks, lead weights, canvas tarps, lime by the barrel, and, curiously, diving bells of the sort used for underwater salvage. When merchants asked, the sisters always had explanations. The diving bells were for retrieving lost items from the creek. The lime was for preserving the fish we smoke. The weights were for anchoring crab pots. All lies. The truth was being constructed beneath the boarding-house, where Cold Creek's unique geography had created something the Morrows recognized as providential, a natural system of tide pools and caverns, accessible through the house's cellar, where the creek's freshwater met Pacific saltwater in chambers that flooded and drained with lunar precision. Abigail Morrow's diary, recovered in 1895 and sealed by court order until 1945, contained this entry from December 1892. "The Lord has shown us the way. Father drowned taking other men's fish. We shall prosper by taking other men's gold. The sea that consumed him shall fill our coffers. Constance and I have surveyed the chambers. At low tide, 12 feet of air. At high tide, complete submersion. A man chained below cannot surface when the water rises. The Pacific claims him as it claimed Father. But unlike Father, these men leave their wealth behind. The Lord's justice, perfectly balanced." Between October 1892 and September 1895, 33 men checked into the Morrow boarding house. 33 men vanished without official trace. Theodore Vasquez had survived Gettysburg, 6 years as a Pinkerton detective, and 2 knife fights in San Francisco's Barbary Coast. At 47, he walked with a limp from Pickett's charge and possessed a mind that saw patterns the way other men saw clouds, shapes emerging from chaos. In March 1895, serving as Deputy U.S. Marshal for the Oregon Territory's Coastal District, Vasquez noticed something wrong with the fishing statistics. Cold Creek reported catching 340 tons of salmon in autumn 1894, the third best yield on the coast. But the registered fishermen numbered only 18. Vasquez, who'd grown up in fishing communities, knew the mathematics. 18 men could not harvest that tonnage. Someone was fishing under false registry, or men were fishing who no longer existed on paper. Vasquez pulled missing persons reports from Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, and Boston. The pattern emerged like a photograph developing in silver nitrate. Robert Chen, 29, San Francisco. Last letter from Cold Creek, October 4, 1893. Michael O'Brien, 34, Boston. Last contact October 12, 1893. Lars Svensson, 41, Seattle. Last seen boarding stage to Coastal Trail, September 28, 1893. James Whitmore, 38, Portland. Wife received final letter postmarked Cold Creek, October 18, 1893. 12 men in 1893 alone, all last placing themselves at or near Cold Creek during fishing season. All seemingly evaporated. All described in letters or final communications as staying at the boarding house run by religious ladies. Vasquez requisitioned travel funds in April 1895. His superior, Marshal Edmund Grant in Portland, denied the request. Fishermen drown. Theodore. They drink, they gamble, they desert families. We don't chase every drunk who wanders off. 12 men. Vasquez pressed. 12 men in one season, all from the same boarding house? Cold Creek is 18 miles of bad trail. I'm not authorizing 3 days' travel on speculation. Vasquez used his own money. He reached Cold Creek on April 22, 1895, after 2 days on horseback through coastal rain that never seemed to stop. The town consisted of 8 structures: general store, 2 warehouses, fish processing shed, 3 fishermen's shacks, and the Morrow boarding house. The boarding house stood isolated on its cliff shelf, a 2-story structure of unpainted cedar with a widow's walk that served no purpose except watching the sea. Smoke rose from twin chimneys. Laundry hung motionless in the wet air, white sheets that looked like surrendering flags. Abigail Morrow answered Vasquez's knock at 3:15 p.m. She stood in the doorframe filling it, her height making Vasquez, at 5'9", feel like a child seeking entry to a giant's home. Deputy Marshal. Her voice was surprisingly melodious. We don't see law often in Cold Creek. What brings federal attention? Vasquez explained he was tracking missing persons, several last seen in this area. Might she remember any guests who'd left suddenly? Marshal, I keep a Christian house. Abigail's pale eyes never blinked. But fishermen are wandering creatures. They come with the salmon, they leave when fish thin. Some pay rent, some don't. Some say goodbye, most just vanish with dawn. It's their nature. Do you keep a registry? Of course. She produced a ledger, leather-bound, meticulously maintained. Vasquez scanned the entries. The handwriting was beautiful, almost ecclesiastical. Names, dates of arrival, dates of departure, amounts paid. Robert Chen, departed October 28, 1893. Paid in full. Michael O'Brien, departed November 3, 1893. Owes $1.50. Lars Svensson, departed October 16, 1893. Paid in full. Vasquez ran his finger down the page. Every missing man appeared in the ledger. Every entry claimed departure, usually with notation of payment status. "Your handwriting," Vasquez observed. "Quite elegant." Father insisted we learn Palmer method. Education in service of the Lord. These men who left, did they say where they were going? South, mostly. Portland. San Francisco. Following work. Abigail closed the ledger with finality. Marshal, fishermen are not settlers. They're migrants. Their families worry, I understand, but these men often simply continue. Vasquez spent 3 days in Cold Creek, interviewing the 8 permanent residents. All confirmed the Morrow sisters were respectable, pious, kept to themselves. The general storekeeper, Jacob Finch, provided the only useful information. They buy a powerful lot of lime, Marshal. And chains. For smoking fish and storm anchors, they say. But... He lowered his voice. My cousin works the Astoria docks. Says the Morrows sell salmon there, a lot of salmon. More than seems right for a boarding house that don't fish itself. Where would they get salmon? Finch shrugged. Dead men's catches, if you believe the dark talk. But I ain't saying I believe it. Just saying what's whispered after whiskey. Vasquez returned to the boarding house on April 25 with a warrant to search the premises, a warrant he'd essentially written himself, given the nearest judge was 4 days' travel away. Constance Morrow answered the door this time. Smaller than her sister, but somehow more unsettling, her colorless eyes tracked Vasquez like rifle sights. A warrant. She read it without expression. The Lord Counsel's cooperation with Caesar's servants. Search as you must, Marshal. Vasquez spent 4 hours examining the boarding house. 6 bedrooms, all spotlessly clean. Kitchen with a cooking stove that could feed 20. Parlor with Bible open to Proverbs on a reading stand. Everything neat. Everything normal. Except the cellar. The cellar stairs descended from the kitchen through a door reinforced with iron strapping, unusual for a simple storage space. The cellar itself extended 30 feet, dug directly into the coastal rock. It smelled of salt and fish and something else Vasquez couldn't quite identify, something organic and wrong. Barrels of lime lined one wall. Coils of chain hung from iron hooks. A workbench held tools. Saws, hammers, long iron hooks of the type used to gaff large fish. In the corner, covered by canvas tarp, Vasquez found the diving bell, a copper cylinder with glass port, designed for underwater work. We recover property from the creek, Abigail said from the stairs behind him. She'd descended silently. Fishermen lose things. We retrieve them for a fee. In diving bells? The creek pools are quite deep, Marshal. 20 feet in places. The bell allows us to work safely. Vasquez examined the cellar floor. The stone was wet despite no apparent water source. He knelt, touched the moisture, tasted it. Salt water. There's seepage, Abigail explained. This close to the Pacific, the rock stays damp. But Vasquez noticed something else. In the corner farthest from the stairs, the stone floor appeared different, newer, less weathered. He walked to it, knelt again. The mortar between stones was fresh, no more than months old. "You've done recent work down here?" "Repairs. The winter storms damaged foundation. We sealed cracks." Vasquez pressed on the stone. It seemed solid. But something about it felt wrong. The way the stones fit too perfectly, the way the mortar was too clean. He couldn't articulate suspicion into evidence. He couldn't demand they tear up the cellar floor on instinct. He left Cold Creek on April 26th with nothing but dark certainty eating his gut. That summer, for more fishermen vanished. All had stayed at the Morrow boarding house. September 8, 1895. 11:47 p.m. Jacob Chen stumbled into Cold Creek's general store covered in seaweed, bleeding from a dozen lacerations, speaking in fragments that made no sense until they made terrible sense. "Underground," he gasped. "Water rising. Chains. Can't breathe." She said, "The Lord takes and the Lord provides." Jacob Chen was 26 years old, a fisherman from Portland whose brother Robert had disappeared in 1893. Jacob had come to Cold Creek in August 1895 specifically to investigate his brother's fate. He'd checked into the Morrow boarding house on August 29th, carrying $340 in gold coin, payment for a fishing boat he'd sold. For 9 days, he'd been a prisoner in hell. Dr. Marcus Webb, Cold Creek's only physician, and only part-time, visiting from Astoria monthly, was fortuitously present when Chen arrived. He documented in his medical journal. Patient presented in acute physiological crisis. Body temperature 94 degrees. Severe dehydration despite obvious saltwater immersion. Wrists and ankles bearing deep ligature marks consistent with prolonged restraint by metal shackles. Multiple lacerations on hands and fingers, defensive wounds suggesting attempts to climb stone surfaces. But most disturbing, patient's skin had taken on translucent qualities seen in prolonged submersion victims. His pupils dilated abnormally in lamplight, suggesting extended darkness adaptation. When given water, he drank with desperate animal urgency, consuming nearly a gallon before vomiting. Between bouts of fever, Chen told his story. The Morrow sisters had served dinner on August 29th, venison stew with bread. Chen remembered feeling drowsy after eating, which he'd attributed to travel exhaustion. He remembered Abigail helping him to his room. He remembered darkness. When he regained consciousness, he was in water. Not floating. Chained. Heavy manacles encircled his wrists and ankles, connected to chains bolted into rock walls. The water was cold, Pacific cold, and came to his chest. Above him, perhaps 12 feet up, he could see a ceiling of rough stone with a gap barely visible in darkness. Around him, he could hear breathing, other men, also chained, also in water. "How many?" Dr. Webb asked. "3. Chen's voice cracked. 3 others. In different chambers. I could hear them. Calling out. Praying. One was crying for his mother." The chambers, Chen explained during his lucid moments, were natural formations beneath the boarding house. Tide pools connected to both Cold Creek and the Pacific through submerged tunnels. The Morrow sisters had modified them, installing chains, creating a system of cages that exploited the tidal cycle. At low tide, the water receded to waist level. Men could breathe, could rest standing on submerged rock shelves. For 6 hours, they lived. At high tide, the Pacific filled the chambers. Water rose to the ceiling, covering everything. For 6 hours, men drowned slowly or held their breath until their bodies overrode their will. Then they drowned quickly. The sisters came at low tide, Chen whispered. Abigail would descend through a passage from the cellar. She'd bring bread, water. She'd quote scripture. Proverbs mostly. "The wealth of the sinner is stored up for the just." She said we were instruments of God's provision. That father drowned enriching other men, and now the sea would enrich her through us. She said our families would think we drowned fishing, noble deaths. But we'd actually drowned serving God's true daughters. The sisters kept men alive for weeks, feeding them minimally, waiting for them to reveal where they'd hidden money, who knew they were in Cold Creek, when someone might come looking. Once they'd extracted all information and any hidden valuables, the sisters simply stopped coming at low tide. The Pacific did the rest. Chen survived through geographic accident. His chamber had a flaw, a crack in the ceiling rock where the tide never quite reached. By standing on his chain's full extension, he could press his face to the gap and breathe through high tide. For 9 days, he'd endured the cycle. 6 hours of air, 6 hours submerged, desperately holding that crack, breathing in gasps through narrow stone while water crushed him from all sides. On September 8th, the bolt holding his ankle chain corroded through. The Pacific had worked for him instead of against him. He'd pulled free, dove during low tide, found the submerged tunnel, and emerged in Cold Creek's mouth half dead. Dr. Webb sent Jacob Finch riding through the night to reach the nearest telegraph station in Tillamook. By dawn September 9th, Vasquez was en route with 6 deputy marshals. They arrived September 11th at 2:30 p.m. Low tide. Abigail and Constance Morrow were in the kitchen when Vasquez kicked in the door. Both sisters were covered in blood to their elbows. They'd been butchering venison, they claimed. The meat on the cutting board looked freshly killed. Vasquez didn't bother with warrants this time. In the cellar, the deputies found the sealed stones Chen had described. Sledgehammers revealed what lay beneath, a narrow passage, angling down into darkness, carved through solid rock. Iron rungs provided handholds. The passage descended 40 feet. Deputy Marshal William Harding volunteered to enter first. At the bottom, carrying a bullseye lantern, he found himself in a natural cavern approximately 60 feet wide where Cold Creek met the Pacific through a complexity of underwater channels. The tide was out. Water stood at 4 feet. And in that water, chained to the walls, were 4 men. 3 were dead, had been dead for days, maybe weeks. They hung in their chains like grotesque marionettes, bodies bloated and partially consumed by crabs that scattered in the lantern light. The 4th, impossibly, was alive. "Help me," he croaked. "Please God, help me." His name was Thomas Morrison, age 31, from Seattle. He'd been in the chambers for 19 days. As deputies worked to free Morrison and recover the bodies, Harding explored further. The main chamber branched into 4 additional pockets, smaller caves that flooded completely at high tide. Each contained chains. Each showed evidence of long use. In the driest corner, above the tide line, Abigail Morrow had created a storage area. Here, deputies found clothing from dozens of men, sorted and folded 127 pocket watches $2, $8.47 in gold coin $6.30 in paper currency 43 wedding rings personal effects, photographs, letters, Bibles, tools a ledger, not the false one shown to Vasquez, but a true accounting. The true ledger contained 33 names. Next to each name, date of capture, date of death, and itemized inventory of property seized. The ledger was meticulous, thorough, maintained in the same beautiful handwriting Vasquez had seen above. Next to Robert Chen's name, Abigail had written, "Died October 31st, 1893. High tide. Fought chains until final breath. Yielded $180 gold, silver watch, good quality, wool coat, fishing gear, sold, boots, too small for trade. The Lord provides." Beside the ledger lay Abigail's diary, 3 years of entries detailing every capture, every death, every dollar accumulated. She'd documented it all with the precision of a ship's captain maintaining log. There was no remorse in the pages. Only accounting, and occasional frustration when prisoners died before revealing all their assets. One entry from March 1894 read, "The Norwegian expired too quickly. High tide caught him unprepared. He'd been sleeping. Drowned in his first submersion. Wasted opportunity." He surely had more coin hidden, but where? Constance says we should strip search them immediately upon capture, but I fear that indignity might break their spirits too soon. A man with hope reveals more than a man in despair. Another, from July 1895, Morrison proves stubborn. 19 days and he admits nothing beyond the $40 we found in his jacket. I know fishermen. They hide coin in boot heels, belt linings, hollowed Bible covers. Constance suggests the water torture. Chain him lower so high tide covers him completely. Let him drown and revive repeatedly until he speaks. I pray for guidance. The Lord says the worker deserves his wages, but does the sinner deserve mercy? Morrison, rescued barely alive, would survive physically. Mentally, he would spend the rest of his life in Oregon State Hospital, unable to sleep without screaming, unable to be near water without panic attacks, unable to close his eyes without seeing the tide rising. Deputies worked through the night of September 11th, recovering bodies. The chambers yielded 23 corpses in various states of decomposition. The coldness of Pacific water and the limestone rock had preserved some remarkably well. Others had been reduced to bones and tatters. Robert Chen, Jacob's brother, was identified by the jade pendant he'd worn since childhood, a gift from their mother. Lars Svensson was identified by his wooden leg. He'd lost the limb in a logging accident years before. The sisters had chained him anyway. His body was found standing upright in his chains, head bent back, mouth open to a ceiling that had been 6 inches too high to offer air. Samuel Hartwick, the first to disappear in 1892, was never found. His chains were empty, bolts intact. Either the tide had carried his body through the underwater passages to the Pacific, or crabs had reduced him to fragments too small to recover. Of 33 men documented in Abigail's ledger, 23 bodies were recovered. 10 remained missing, presumably swept out to sea or consumed entirely by the Pacific ecosystem the Morrows had used as execution chamber.